Work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
All right, hey, peace. Thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. I have really been anticipating this episode, really been anticipating this show. Today, we're joined by the author of the Minneapolis Police Department Blue Code of Silence, the true story of the murder of Terrance Franklin, Mr. Mike Padden. Mike served as a legal representative, the lawyer for the Franklin family in the civil suit that happened after Terrance's murder. And really, to frame this conversation, I think it's important for me to say I remember May 10th, 2013. I was 28 years old. The murder of Terrance Franklin had an incredible impact on a whole generation of people in Minneapolis. Of course, he wasn't the first victim of police violence in this city, but when he was killed, it really ripped through the community. It really politicized a lot of people. This was kind of the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black lives and justice that has really continued to rise throughout the decade, and we saw really come to a new stage in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, where the rest of the world kind of got a window into how violent and how criminal the Minneapolis Police Department is. And then last summer, I was scrolling on my phone and I came across a Time magazine reporting about the murder of Terrance Franklin, and it absolutely lit me on fire, reopened this wound, because we knew that Terrance Franklin never got justice. And this report surfaced some new evidence in the case that really made it clear that what MPD had presented to the public was a fabrication, something that many of us suspected and knew. And that reporting from Time magazine was really based on the book that our guest here wrote today. So I'm really honored and pleased to have you on the show. Mike, could you introduce yourself to our audience?
I appreciate you having me, Jake. Thank you. My name is Mike Padden. I've been practicing law for 35 years in Minnesota. I'm licensed in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and also in federal court. I've been primarily a civil litigator during my career, Jake, but I also handle criminal law.
Okay. Can you, how did you end up becoming the legal representative of the Franklin family?
Well, when that tragedy happened, I was somebody who was, I think is fair to say, a lawyer who was very deeply connected in the African-American community in Minneapolis. I think there was a relatively short list of lawyers who handle civil rights cases. And I think I'm somebody even back then who would be categorized as someone who takes on tough cases involving police excessive force. I don't know exactly how it was that Walt Franklin called me. Walt is Mookie's father, but I wrote that in the book. A lot of times cases begin with a phone call, and then the next thing I know, I'm speaking with him. We met, and he felt I was the right lawyer for what we knew going in was going to be a tough case.
Absolutely. And I learned in the book and us talking that you've worked on some other high-profile cases. So maybe I'm hoping at the end we could come back and talk a bit about Fong Lee. But I want to really get into your book and get into the case of Terrance's murder. And like you said, Terrance was known as Mookie to his family and friends. A really well-loved person Mookie was. Can you talk about what happened on May 10th, 2013? Can you kind of set the stage? You do a great job in your book of kind of describing this fateful day. What happened on May 10th, 2013?
Yeah, he was at an apartment complex in South Minneapolis, and there was a 911 call that he was alleged to have been a suspect at a home burglary something like 8 days before. So this was not a situation where he was in flight from, having committed a murder or a bank robbery or some heinous crime. The police merely arrived there, presumably to question him. When they arrived, he was in a car, and he did intentionally leave. It's clear that he did not want to be apprehended. But a significant part of the case, and this came out in the beginning, was the contention by officers who were at the scene of the initial attempted apprehension. He tried to run over a police officer. Fortunately for us and the next of kin of Mookie, there was video at the apartment complex which showed that he didn't attempt to run over anybody. And
Absolutely.
something I think that was well pointed out by the Time magazine story. So it's another example, Jake, where video is so important to kibosh what was originally a false narrative that was perpetuated by this agency.
Absolutely.
Then he ended up in a home in South Minneapolis in the basement. He broke into the home. It's obvious, I contend, that he was really scared. He was like a scared rabbit in flight. And since they thought that he attempted to run a police officer over, which wasn't the case, it was a full-blown manhunt. I mean, they were out for blood, I contend.
Yeah. And there's, witnesses to the day say that the scene was absolutely swarmed. Every officer who was able to get there got there, everybody with their guns drawn, a really intense, amplified situation.
Right. Yeah, they were loaded for bear, it's clear. So the SWAT team that went down into the basement to get him, and they knew he was down there. It's clear that they knew he was down there. I contend that they were hell-bent on going down there and letting the dog bite him a few times and beat him up and give him what for trying to get away. And I don't think, though, that when they went down in the basement, they were intent on killing him. I think it was what happened in the basement with what I allege was a negligent discharge that amped them up to the level of committing murder.
Yeah. So the SWAT team goes down into the basement, and we'll get into all the details as we go through the interview. Terrance is murdered in the basement. And how does the MPD come out and say happened? What does the MPD come out and say happened? It's also important for us to name here that there was another tragedy this day. The MPD murdered another person. An officer was speeding to the scene 40 minutes after the murder, ran through a red light and struck a man who was on a motorcycle and killed that man. Just again, that shows the mind state that the police were in that day, and just unspeakable negligence by the MPD to kill another person.
Well, I think the significance of that was that they really went into circle the wagons mode. They had two big time problems. A, they killed a suspect who everybody agreed wasn't armed. B, in an act of negligence, unintentional conduct, driving to the scene 35 minutes after Mookie was killed, there was an accident with a motorcycle where a Hispanic male was killed and his girlfriend was seriously injured. So the significance of that, again, was they really had a major PR problem on their hands, and they were intent, I think, on developing a scenario that made them look good, that this, what I claim was a false narrative. I claim that the false narrative began that evening at headquarters when the team was all together. And the false narrative was that Terrance had grabbed an officer's gun, an MP5, a rifle, and shot two officers, and then they dispatched him. We did not believe that for a minute, and that really what the case was all about. Was he murdered or was he killed for good reason? That was really the legal issue at the end of the day.
Yeah, I remember, reading in the newspapers and seeing on the news that story that somehow Terrance Franklin seized an officer's gun and shot two officers, and it didn't pass the smell test for really anybody with common sense. You know what I'm saying? In the city, like it smelled foul off top.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. In a situation like that, it's tough because they didn't have body cams, and I think they thought they could do anything they wanted, and that there were no witnesses, and that they were just going to do what they wanted to do, and that was the end of it. And thankfully for us, there was evidence that developed that was able, we believe, to prove that not only was this a murder, it was a cover-up that evolved to prevent the two men who murdered Mookie, from getting away with it. So
yes, absolutely. So the MPD puts this false story to the public. You come on the team. Can you talk about this crucial piece of evidence, this video? Like you said, there was no body cameras involved, but turns out there was some video footage. Could you talk about how you became aware of that footage and then what that footage revealed to you?
I was hired about 2 weeks after it happened. And then once I was hired, there were family members that contacted me and then other people in the community that just were hitting me up left and right and said, Mr. Padden, you need to listen to this video. And it was pretty much a miracle, to be honest with you, because if it wasn't for this video, I don't think this case would have survived summary judgment or even a motion to dismiss. The man was standing across the street. He was at a friend's home. And because of what you mentioned earlier, this electricity in the air that something bad was going to happen, he decided to start recording. All he had, Jake, was an iPod Touch. It's an antiquated device now. I don't even think they make them anymore.
It's funny when I read in your book, it was an iPod Touch. I was like, oh, I forgot about iPods. Like, that's so weird.
I know. Yeah, and these devices are amazing. It looks like a phone for people who don't know, but it doesn't have phone capability. And so all this guy did was he started videotaping, and the visual images are important, but what's more important is what his device picked up, the sounds that came from the basement. We thought for the longest time that the reason we were able to hear the sounds from the basement and words from the basement was because we thought there was the possibility that one of the officers in the basement had an open shoulder mic. But after we retained an expert and looked into this, what happened was there was a door that was relatively close to how they accessed the basement. This was a very small basement. It's the smallest basement in the history of basements. And this door was opened after they brought out one of the injured officers. And because that door was opened, that's how we were able to pick up these sounds. Had that door remained closed, I give you 100% guarantee we never would have gotten that evidence.
Yeah, yeah. So when you listen to the audio and listen to the video, how did it change the case? What did it reveal? What did it show?
Well, I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest version, because to explain it competently would probably take an hour or 2 hours.
Yeah, right. I hear you.
I'll do the best I can to cut to the chase. The visual image was important because we knew there was an officer that ran around the north side of the house toward his squad, and he said, "Officer shot." So that was significant because we knew at that point that would be a specific line of demarcation as to when we knew an officer had been shot. Now, the fact he articulated officer shot at that point, it's reasonable to assume that he would have known about that at an earlier time before he articulated that. So this was really important because we had to establish there was a time gap problem for the police department, in the sense that if this kid really grabbed a gun and shot two of their guys, every one of them had sidearms. It would have taken them a second or two to kill him, right?
He would have been shot immediately. Yeah.
Right. And it was funny because when we got into depositions, only one of them would give us a time estimate from the time that he allegedly shot the two officers to the time they killed him. And that one officer who committed to it made clear it was a very short amount of time. The problem for them was, based on the extrapolation of the evidence and what we did with it, the time that was involved from the time that we know an officer was shot up until the time they killed Terrance was in excess of 70 seconds, which for that case is an eternity.
Absolutely.
The other thing that's important, there's a lot of important things. I'll hit the top 3 or 4. They claim that he never uttered a word. Well, 9 seconds into the tape, after the time you hear officer shot, Terrance says his name, which is Mookie, and you can hear it clear as day. And I had at least 20 people that identified that was his voice. Later on, he says, "Man, let me go," which is right after you hear the N word. So I think he was mad about the fact that they were calling him a racial slur. But the most important soundbite, I would argue, is near the end, right before you can hear the volleys that kill him. You can actually hear the shots. They're loud booms. You hear, and it's clearly an officer saying, "Come out, little N-word. Don't go putting those hands up now." And that's a quote.
Yeah.
That was really important because I think the "don't go putting those hands up now" was a way of saying we wouldn't be in this excrement show where 2 of our guys were accidentally injured had you given up in the beginning. So I think it was a negligent discharge juxtaposed with the fact that they thought he tried to kill a police officer that had the conduct of at least 2 of the 5 rise to a level of being homicidal. And I want to be clear about something. There were 5 officers in that base. We only claim that 2 committed murder.
Yeah.
The other 3 we claim are guilty of a cover-up, not for committing murder. So I want to be fair about that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, and we're going to get into some of the details of, that time lapse and what happened in the basement, but that's a really great summary of what happened. And you can see clearly the police department story falls apart right with the time lapse. Even that case, there's no way that over a minute would have passed if he shot an officer with their gun. So can you talk about, there's obviously controversy happens after this. The community feels like obviously the story isn't adding up. We have a young unarmed black man murdered by the police. There's pressure, protests, and the MPD investigates, or kind of investigates. Can you talk about who took on the investigation then of these officers, and why were they cleared of any criminal charges?
This was the last case in agency history that was investigated in-house.
Wow.
Ever since that time, MPD has never conducted an investigation in-house. As I'm talking to you right now, Jake, no agency has done an independent investigation of this case, which is a travesty. I predicted early on that that the truth wasn't going to come out based on a ridiculous investigation, and then, not only would there not be any criminal charges, there would not be any internal discipline. And I correctly predicted that.
Ugh.
To tell you what a farce it was, to tell you how absolutely farcical it was, the Gaines evidence, and I want to be clear about something, the Gaines evidence is significant, but there's a whole slew of other evidence that supports that this was a murder. It's not just Gaines. Gaines is very important, and it's kind of a stepping stone to everything else.
And the Gaines evidence is the footage. It was recorded by a man named Jimmy Gaines.
Yes, sir. And so then what happened was, as this thing evolved, we knew that the grand jury was going to be a joke because Gaines never testified before the grand jury. So if Gaines didn't testify, that means the video didn't go into evidence, and the grand jurors never would have heard any of that evidence. I give you 100% guarantee that had the correct evidence been presented to this grand jury, there would have been indictments for murder.
So that's just like astonishing that the main piece of evidence, this video that was public, posted on YouTube, people brought to your attention, was never taken into consideration in the official investigation, never shown to the grand jury. The MPD didn't care about it. They didn't look at it, didn't analyze it. It's just really astonishing. But that's their mode of operation.
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off, Jake. All they did was they secured it off of YouTube, put it into evidence, and they never did. And I established this through sworn under oath depositions, that they never engaged in any attempt whatsoever to hire an expert to enhance the audio to, try to ascertain what could be heard. To me, you can hear it. The main stuff you can hear without the need of enhancement, frankly. If anybody doesn't agree with me, watch the Time magazine video. The phrase I just told you, come out little end, don't go putting those hands up now. They played that twice in the documentary. And I think anybody who listens to that will see that what I'm saying is 100% true.
Yeah, I just watched the Time documentary again this morning, and absolutely, it's there. I really will link to it in the interview so people can see it. It's a really powerful piece. It shows his family, it shows his son. It's just heart-wrenching,
Jake,
so
I'm not creative enough to make something like that up. I mean,
exactly. It's evidence. It's and really salute to Jimmy Gaines, who also appears in the documentary, just like a really important decision, and why it's really important to film the police. When you see an interaction, if you feel something, it could make a world of difference. So we have this fraud sham investigation that gives, the cops get off, the cops have no consequences, there's no criminal charges, but now you take on a civil case. So can you talk a bit about the civil case? What does that mean? Even for some listeners who see cops get off in criminal court, could you even just give us a brief overview of what civil court even is, and then talk a bit about your case? And then I want to ask you about, we talked about the Gaines video and the time lapse, but I also want to talk about the gun, the MP5, and the accidental discharge. If you could walk us through the evidence on that front.
Yeah, what happens, Jake, is when you start a lawsuit like this, it's grounded in the legal theories of wrongful death, and it's considered a 1983 claim under federal law. That's a very important federal statute that permits people who can sue law enforcement for cases of excessive force. And if you prevail, you can get your attorney's fees for all the hard work and time you put into it, as one example of many. So that's what we did. The complaint, for your listeners, it's easily accessible on the internet. And I put 100 hours of time into that. I think it's very well written. And in fact, I think it's the best legal document I've ever prepared.
Wow.
And I have co-counsel on the case. I wasn't alone on this case. I had a lot of help, but that complaint was pretty much me. And the introduction part of it, I think people really dig that because it really speaks in terms of the history and the reality of abuse by the Minneapolis Police Department when it comes to people of color.
That's great. We'll link to it in the show description too, so people will be able to access it easy.
If you need it, I can email it to you too, Jake.
Great. Thank you. So in that case, obviously you present the Gaines footage, and you talked about how that one reveals the time gap between the MPD story. One other thing a piece of evidence I want to talk about is the MPD came out quickly and said that they found Terrance Franklin's DNA on the MP5 machine gun rifle that fired and hit the two officers. So we've established two officers were shot in the basement. One officer went down into the basement with a MP5 slung over his body, and that was the gun that hit two officers. And when the MPD dropped that contention publicly that Terrance Franklin's DNA was on the trigger, that, was supposed to be the end of it. But you took a closer look at the evidence. Can you describe your theory around that DNA? What evidence did you find, and how did you present it? Well,
DNA is something that really can be manipulated in the wrong way such that people don't get justice. And this case is a prime example of that. What happened here, which again was practically in a category of a miracle, was we knew that Terrance didn't have anything to do with that gun and he never touched it. So the question would be, how did his DNA end up on the gun, right? It's a reasonable question. So MPD illegally leaked that information to a member of the Star Tribune, and then that story appeared in the paper.
Wow.
The problem was they didn't tell the public the total story, and this is what happened. I'm not going to name the officer. It's a matter of public record, but an officer from another agency went down in that basement right after Franklin was murdered, and he checked for a pulse on Terrance to see if he was alive, which is a normal thing to do. He checked the brachial and the carotid pulse. The carotid pulse is the neck, and then the brachial is near the bicep. So he wouldn't have had to go under clothing or whatever to see if he was alive if he had a pulse.
Right.
He obviously did not detect the pulse. The kid was shot 12 times, including multiple shots to the right side of the head.
Just a savage murder.
It was perfectly consistent with an execution type killing, I would allege.
Yeah.
So what happened was this guy puts his right hand on the kid's body, and he would have used the index finger and the middle finger pressed against his body. Well, lo and behold, what happened was soon after that happened, the handler of the MP5, an officer named Duran, then handed the gun to this same officer that checked for signs of life. And he would have grabbed it at the stock, and then he would have put it over his shoulder. This is all documented report to affix it to his body. And sure enough, the stock, the end of the gun, it's a match to this man's DNA with Franklin as a possible contributor. So we know right away that he's inadvertently transferring Franklin's DNA to the gun.
Yeah.
This was not, I want to be clear, this was not intentional.
Right.
And then the grip, it was the same thing. This officer's DNA was a match with Franklin as a possible contributor, but then there was something else that happened. These two fingers here, the grip on the MP5 is called a 3-finger grip. So when you grip it like this, these two fingers are out, and they're in a position where they end up inadvertently brushing the side of the trigger.
Yeah, somebody can imagine that your finger and your pointer and your ring finger with your bottom two on the handle, index finger.
Yeah, the index finger and the middle finger. So
that's right.
DNA was. So it was positioned exactly where it would brush the side of the trigger. Now, he wouldn't have been worried about the trigger because the gun was in a safe mode at that point. It couldn't be shot. It was in a safe setting. So we believe what happened was Terrance is, and sure enough, you ready for this? At the trigger site, it was a match to Terrance Franklin, but this officer as a possible contributor. That's exactly what you would expect to find in the event that the DNA had been inadvertently, accidentally transferred from his body to that gun. The Minneapolis Police Department conveniently didn't say one word about that to the public.
Right.
So the point is, it was a completely innocent explanation as to how the kid's DNA ended up on the gun. And this was something that was not addressed and dealt with publicly until we filed paperwork in the case. And of course, I address it in my book, and I don't go into deep detail on that particular issue in my book, but the bottom line, people can see how evidence like that can be horribly misportrayed and result in in an injustice. And that's what happened here.
Absolutely. So really, like, what you allege happened in the basement was accidental fire, accidental discharge. So rather than Terrance, out wrestling 5 people and able to seize a gun that was slung over the body of an officer and shooting 2 officers, and then somehow not, 60, 70 seconds later is killed. That's a implausible scenario. A more plausible scenario is that this officer accidentally discharged his gun twice. And you talk about how none of the officers are able to name how they were shot. The officers who sustained the injury, they never saw it happen. Yeah. And then you name, how did this officer, you talk about the officer when he comes out of the basement, the officer who was carrying had that machine gun strapped on him. What did he say when he handed over the gun that also supports this idea that it wasn't Terrance?
He made 2 extremely inculpatory comments that made it clear that it was a case of accidental discharge. He says to his lead supervisor, his sergeant, worse the effect of, he says to him, "This was the gun that caused the injuries," right? Now, to me, Jake, you don't make a statement like that. If the gun was grabbed by a suspect and the suspect shot 2 of your guys, you're going to say something like, this is the gun the a-hole grabbed, or whatever cuss word you want to use, right?
They would probably use the N-word, I imagine. That seemed to be their favorite word. Yeah.
Right. But you're not going to say, "Sarge, this was the gun that caused the injury." You would say that if it was the gun where you're trying to assuage your guilt and trying to blame the gun.
It's like when somebody makes an error in baseball and they look at their glove, like it was the glove's fault. That's what I was thinking when I read that part of your book.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. But then he also, to the guy he handed the gun to, he said a similar statement. I can't remember exactly what it was, but when I took that man's deposition, he even said under oath, he said, and he said something to me that was really strange. He said X. And I mean, even that cop thought it was bizarre what he said, but it wouldn't be bizarre in the event that he accidentally discharged his gun.
Yeah.
What happened then was, we allege they grabbed Franklin by the hair, by the dreads, grabbed him into a little room, a small laundry room, closed the door, and then executed him. And then sure enough, in the spot where he was executed, you actually see a pulled out dread right in the same area where Franklin was executed.
Another piece of evidence that you show that really crumbles the MPD story is they allege that if he would have been killed right when he shot the gun, there was blood everywhere. Like you said, he was shot 12 times, multiple times in the head, but the MP5, the gun, had no blood on it whatsoever. So there's no way it could have been in that laundry room where he was murdered.
Right. Yeah, there's really 5 or 6 really important facts. Number 1 is the Gaines video. Number 2, the fact the door was closed when the kid was killed. That's huge. That's because even though it was obvious what they were going to do, they didn't even want their other guys to see what they were about to do. You know what I mean? But
yeah.
Yes, the gun, if the gun was in the middle of this fracas, and the analogy I give people is, I think people who have seen the Vietnam era film image of the North Vietnamese officer being shot in the temple and how the blood comes gushing out.
Yeah.
It's a horrible, terrible way to die, but the blood there's blood everywhere. And he was shot in the head at least 5 or 6 times. And they admitted that there was blood everywhere. I hope people that are listening to this are sitting down, because this is the kind of thing that can affect your physical equilibrium.
Yeah.
The gun that they claim was in the middle of this fracas was completely free, not even a speck of blood on it. And that was testimony I secured from the forensic people who were employees of MPD. So they had, they got no reason to lie. They're
Yeah.
just telling the truth as they recall it. So if the gun wasn't in the room and the gun was affixed to this officer with a harness, so the gun didn't leave him, if the gun wasn't in the room, that means that the handler of the MP5 wasn't in the room. That's an incredibly important piece of evidence. I'm glad you asked me about it, Jake.
Yeah, I really am going to encourage readers to read the book because it's really accessible, but it goes into the way this evidence is compiled and presented in court. There's a good window into the legal process, and you really get a good understanding of all these different pieces of evidence and how they really disprove the MPD case and paint a really like a picture of what happened in that basement. I want to talk about another piece of evidence. So we've talked about the basement, and I just want to name it quick because you already talked about it. There was another video which showed that Terrance absolutely did not try to run over a police officer. He swerves around and leaves the parking lot, and the officer actually tries to kick his car. And this is the officer who then it went out over the police radio that, Terrance was tried to run over an officer. And we already covered that. So I just wanted to name that. The next thing I want to get into is, your book is called The Blue Code of Silence. And can you talk about the story that was concocted by the officers, the two who killed him and their three colleagues who were in the basement? One, when were they first interviewed, and what was the process like where they were able to put this story together? I think that says a lot about how police departments operate. And then I want you to speak on, if you could, their theory of, you called it, I think, the automaton theory. They presented Terrance as some kind of Superman. I think that's also, could you talk about that whole piece kind of?
We call it the automaton theory. He was kind of like, I'm sure people have seen the movie The RoboCop, the super, you can't do anything to a RoboCop. He was kind of like a robo suspect. The story they had was pretty laughable. Was he never said a word, that they punched him, they assaulted him, and there was no reaction whatsoever, and that he had superhuman strength and he was able to throw them off. It was just complete nonsense.
And I think important to name that strategy has been used to vilify and justify the murder of black men for generations. It's all of a sudden black men are superhuman, don't feel pain, and anything you do to them is justified because they're just crazy killers. So it's like MPD recycling a very old racist trope.
And Jake, the other thing was that they claimed numerous times that he wasn't apprehended. Well, first of all, he says his name in the beginning of the Gaines video, right? So if he's saying his name, that means he's been apprehended. They're asking him his name to make sure they got the right guy. So that's the first piece of evidence to prove that he's been apprehended. Then when they start calling him racial slurs, he says, "Man, let me go," which you would assume from that he has been apprehended. They have him. They physically have him, right?
Right.
And at the end you have, come out little end, don't go putting those hands up now. So that's further evidence. What happened, and maybe I should give an explanation there. I think after they apprehended him, they knew he wasn't going anywhere. They went away from him to deal with the two injured officers.
Right.
And when the officer says at the end of the tape, "Don't go putting those hands up now," that's further evidence that Terrance capitulated, because he's got his hands up in the air, making it clear that, look, you guys got me. I'm not giving up here. Right. Absolutely. You got three strong pieces of evidence that he's been apprehended. I mean, it's ridiculous.
It really is. It's such a travesty of justice. And can you talk about how were the officers able to come up with their story? When were they first approached by investigators?
They didn't give their statements until multiple days later, which is laughably absurd. That's their policy. They don't have any trouble. They talk about, the trauma of the event. Well, they don't have any trouble taking statements right away from friends or family of the deceased. Exactly. They could care less about their trauma, right?
Exactly.
We think the false narrative began that evening when they were all together at headquarters. I've got a pretty good idea who we believe concocted the false narrative. I don't want to say it in this interview. I think it's pretty easy to ascertain from reading my book.
Absolutely.
They had assistance from somebody outside of their little group, put it that way.
Yeah, who they're all meeting with, huddling together the day that this happened, coming up with the story. Yeah.
They're all together at headquarters that evening. The
Uh,
very next day, the beginnings of the false narrative begins, but even then, they don't specifically say that the suspect shot 2 of their guys, but you can tell that they're moving in that direction.
right.
And it takes multiple days for the agency to even give a press release kind of laying out the basics of what they claim happened. But we think the false narrative really was concocted that evening when they were all, and the killing of Mookie happened at 3:30 p.m. The officers would have all been together at City Hall or headquarters that evening, and we think that's when the false narrative began. But the earliest that the statement was secured from any of the 5 was 3 days later, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, it really is. And then some of them not till weeks after that.
Yeah, the 2 injured ones, I guess to a certain extent you could understand the longer time frame for the 2 injured cops, but the one officer, the injuries really weren't that significant. The other officer, an MP5 is really a powerful, and that's the other thing. Why bring an MP5 down there? You don't need it.
Yeah,
You're bringing a rifle down there.
Really,
you got
in a
dog
cramped basement. Yeah, it's absurd.
which enhances the prospect for negligent discharge, I would allege.
Absolutely, I agree. I just got a few more questions for you. Could you tell us, so the 2 officers who actually did the execution are named Lucas Peterson and Michael Meath. Could you just give us some background on those officers? One thing that I learned reading your book is they actually grew up together. They were high school buddies.
Well,
what did you find out about their background?
I would ask people to watch. This can easily be found. Channel 5 last March did a deep dive into the history of Lucas Peterson. They did a great story. People can easily find that. Let me just give you a couple of highlights of his career. In 2002, just 11 years before the Franklin incident, he smothered a black man to death, attempting to apprehend him. He claims he did nothing wrong. The witnesses, the family at the scene of that death, claim that the man didn't do anything wrong. He was not disciplined at all. He had a long history of acts that resulted in the city paying large sums of money due to his conduct in the field.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is all public. The Star Tribune, weeks after Franklin's death, did a long, detailed story about Peterson's background. He also lied in an official police report about a black woman who he claimed had assaulted his partner. With one problem for him: a city video picked up that she didn't assault anybody, and he really didn't receive any kind of discipline for that. The lawyer who represented those people, by the way, is now a Ramsey County judge, an African-American man.
Oh, wow.
And that's also detailed in the Times story and also detailed in the Channel 5 story. So I'm not going to go into Meath's background, but Peterson really has significant dirty laundry, and he's exactly the kind of guy that you would expect to engage in this type of conduct. He should have been fired from the agency long before Franklin was killed.
Yeah, it's really it says a lot about the type of agency it is too, because you said that long list, a murder that's really reminiscent of George Floyd's murder that he was never held accountable for. And then, there's quotes from John Delmonico, of officers, saying he's the type of guy we want on the force. He's really like the model police officer. It's a very toxic culture there. Can you talk about, so you put together this powerful case, and just give us the quick version of how did the civil case play out? How long did it take? And then what ended up being the final, how did it resolve?
It took a ridiculous 7 years because they brought a motion for summary judgment that was denied by a federal court judge in Minnesota, Donovan Frank. They took it up to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. They lost that appeal. They then tried to get an appeal to get review with the United States Supreme Court, and that ended up being kind of a close call. That the court almost reviewed it, but they didn't. This took 7 years, almost 7 years, to litigate. We settled the case for $795,000 in February of 2020, just approximately 3 months before George Floyd was killed.
Wow.
I want to tell your listeners something that has evolved since that I think is important to note. Time Magazine did their story in June. Channel 5 did their story in March. Time Magazine's story, of course, included a documentary. as a result of that publicity, both the Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman and the Attorney General Keith Ellison learned of this case, more detail about the case, which I would claim that Mr. Freeman didn't know about previously. Time Magazine came and interviewed each in person, and they both said on the record that they wanted justice for this case, and they were extremely disturbed about this case. In early November, a story appeared in the Star Tribune that, well, there have been earlier stories that the 5 officers now have lawyers through the Minneapolis Police Federation. And then a November 8th story in the Star Tribune reported that two of the officers are deep in negotiations concerning immunity. So it sounds like what's happening, and I don't know for sure, that the witness officers that went in that basement are being offered immunity to tell the truth about what happened.
Wow.
And it's possible that there could be a criminal prosecution. So it's pretty exciting.
That really is. That really is.
Yeah. And let me just note, people might wonder what the officers who didn't actually kill Franklin would be looking at. There's a statute under Minnesota law called accomplice after the fact. If you lie in an official police investigation, you're looking at half of the time of the principal crime. If the principal crime here is second-degree murder, the not premeditated murder of a citizen, that's 40 years. They could be looking at 20 years for we allege lying in an official police investigation. So they would have significant incentive for accepting immunity and telling the truth. I'm going by what I read in the paper. I'm not in the loop that way. We have been in touch with the prosecuting authority as counsel for the victim.
Yeah.
That's normal. But I'm not in a position to know exactly what's going on. I just know from what I read in the paper on November 8th. But for people that want justice for this case, that's a pretty exciting development. And
it is. It is. You know, we got to keep the public pressure up. Yeah.
I think there could be criminal prosecutions of the 5 officers. So we're pretty excited about that for obvious reasons.
Yeah. And one thing I just want to say is my understanding that Lucas Peterson is still on the force and actually trains the SWAT team now. So the prospect of criminal charges is huge. And like, I want to say salute to you, Mike, and, you know, for the hard work that you did on the legal team. And I found this book really, really important and really, really useful. And I know that you taking the time and putting the effort into write this book and put the book forward, publish it, is really contributing to the struggle to get justice for Mookie, for Terrance Franklin. So I really appreciate that. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I think the last question I'll ask you is, you know, why did you decide to write the book? Like, what was going on in your life at that time, and how, what's it been like for you? What impact has it had on you?
I wrote the book after the George Floyd tragedy. That was my primary impetus, Jake, was after Floyd was killed. I felt I had to tell this story. And the other thing that was helpful to me is I'm a busy attorney, and with COVID, a lot of my cases were pushed out. So it gave me a little more time, a little more free time to be able to write.
Yeah. A
lot of it just kind of came out of me because I knew it so well, but it took me about 4 months to write it. But the primary reason I wrote the book was not to hopefully get a criminal prosecution. That was the last thing on my mind. I didn't even think something like that was possible, to be honest.
Yeah.
I wrote it because I wanted people to see a prime example in print of how the blue code of silence works in the real world. That's why I wrote the book.
Hey, well, you really accomplished that, and it's really important work, and I really appreciate it. I actually have some copies that I'm going to offer up to listeners, you know, and it's a really important book to read.
Can I say one more thing, Jake?
Please do. Please do.
The book is very easy to find. All you have to do is go to any reasonable search engine like Google and just type in MPPD Blue Code of Silence. It pops right up.
Yeah.
With tax and shipping and handling, this is not going to hurt anybody's pocketbook. It's less than $20. So, I mean, that's what you pay when you go to a restaurant and get one of those double appetizers. So
right.
it's not expensive. I hope that your listeners will get the book, and I'm going to eventually be going on a tour around the U.S. to sell this book and present it to people. And, I want people to know what this is about, and it's going to be exciting. I'm going to be speaking at high schools and presenting this all around the U.S. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's really important work. It's really important work, and we salute you for that. I'll say maybe we could have you back on to talk about Fong Lee, because that's a whole nother case, and I got to get going. But yeah, we'll stay in touch, and I really appreciate you joining us.
Well, I appreciate you reaching out to me, sir. Thank you for having me on.
Definitely money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep them coming. Bands building up the company. Shauna told me I was gonna be prosperous. I listen. I'm just praying, making plays a positive addition. Trying to knock me off my spot.